Welcome everyone. The webinar is about to begin. Please be advised that this webinar will be recorded, and to ensure a better recording quality, we would like to ask you to keep your mic muted during the presentation. You will have the opportunity to interact with the speaker in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. If you have any question or comment during the presentation, please enter it in the chat, and we will go over some of the questions or comments at the end, time allowing, of course. My name is Qinxin Lin. I'm the current chair of TESOL Bilingual Multilingual Education Interest Section. Again, I want to extend my warmest welcome to all of you. What you are participating now is a part of the TESOL B-MEIS webinar series, which is dedicated to exploring critical issues in bilingual multilingual education. Our webinar celebrates diverse perspective, as our goal is to build conversation on how to support, elevate, sustain, and transform bilingual and multilingual education. Okay, all participants today will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within a week after today. And we will post a link in this social media platform, MyTESOL, Facebook, and Twitter. So please make sure that you follow us. We would love to hear from you and continue the conversation. And I will put this information in the chat later for your convenience. And now I'm going to transfer the floor to our members at the lodge, Zhongfen Tian and Xin Chen, who will be our today's moderator. And they have worked very hard on planning this webinar titled Hip Hop and Translanguaging, Negotiate Community Participation. They will introduce today's speakers for us. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Okay, Zhongfen.
Yeah, thank you, Qingqing. We can keep the screen. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you again, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Zhongfen Tian. I'm currently an assistant professor of TESOL Applied Linguistics at the University of Texas at San Antonio. My colleague Xin Chen and I will be the moderators of today's webinar. Today, we have 4 panelists joining us to share their expertise on this very important topic on hip hop and translanguaging. We will first have 3 presentations with 12 minutes for each, and then followed by a 10-minute discussion by Professor Angeline. The rest time will be Q&A. Let me first introduce our panelists first. Our first presenter is Dr. Benji Chang. Dr. Benji Chang is Assistant Professor of Equity Education in the School of Education and International and Global Studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He is also adjunct faculty at the Education University of Hong Kong. Dr. Chang's work focuses on teacher education, community engagement, and language literacy and culture, with publications in venues like Linguistics and Education and Curriculum Inquiry. He currently serves on the Teachers College Record Board and is also co-editor of Critical Inquiry in Language Studies. Prior to UNCG, he was a hip hop artist, inner city classroom teacher, and fellow of NCTE and Teachers College, Columbia University. Xin will introduce the next 2 speakers.
Thank you, Zhongfen. Hello, everyone. My name is Xin, and I'm a faculty in the school of, I'm a faculty at the business school in Indiana University, Bloomington. And it's my pleasure today to introduce you 2 of our speakers. First, Jae-Ham In is a PhD candidate in the Department of Literacy, Culture, and Language Education at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is interested in translingualism, teacher identity, hip-hop-based education, and discursive psychology. His recent publication can be found in Applied Linguistics Review and Journal of Multicultural Discourses. And the other of our speakers is Brooke Scriber. She is an assistant professor of English department at Baruch College, the City University of New York, where she teaches courses in writing and linguistics. Her research focuses on second language writing, pedagogy, and teacher training, as well as global English and translingualism. Her work has appeared in TESOL Quarterly, ELT Journal, the Journal of Second Language Writing, Composition Studies, and Language Learning and Technology. She is also the co-editor of a forthcoming collection with multilingual matters on linguistics, justice, and multilingual writers. And then Zhongfeng will introduce our discussant today, Professor Andrej Lin.
Thank you, Xin. Our discussant today is Professor Andrej Lin. Professor Andrej Lin received her doctoral degree from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto in 1996. Her research and teaching have focused on critical discourse analysis, critical literacies, bilingual and multilingual education. She has published 6 research books and over 100 research articles and book chapters, and serves on the editorial boards of leading international research journals. She was a full professor at the Faculty of Education, University of Hong Kong, before moving in 2018 to Simon Fraser University to take up the position of Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in Prolingual and Intercultural Education. During our presentation, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box and stay muted. I will monitor the chat box and we will come back to those questions during our Q&A session. This webinar will be recorded and shared on our TESOL YouTube channel afterwards. So without further ado, we are going to start with our first presentation. I will also be the timekeeper for each presentation. Dr. Chang, the floor is yours now.
Okay, so switching over to my screen. All right, can everybody see that? It's okay. All right. All right, nice to see everybody, and thanks for tuning in wherever you are in the world. It's kind of cool to do this presentation today. Normally, you have your university affiliation on there, but I also get to put in my DJ artist identities of the DP Sound and Cerritos All Stars crews. To kind of give you an idea of how I locate myself within this work, I put some images of artists from places where I've lived and worked, including Los Angeles, the graffiti arts crew, NASA, Native Guns from California and Texas, in Dr. Lin's work, the infamous LMF from Hong Kong, and now in North Carolina, one of the finest MCs in hip hop Rhapsody. I don't enter this conversation strictly as an academic. I grew up within the multiracial hip hop culture scene in Los Angeles, and engaging in battles and with the gang presence with the youth, the house party scene, and then moving on to the entertainment industry, mobilizing college students of color around social justice education issues, and then finally to community centers, grassroots organizing, and education scholarship. This is an example of some of the spaces I've been in, whether in like kind of hip hop in the mainstream or underground, or specific Asian American venues. So what do we mean by hip hop? Just kind of operationalizing terms here. It's been around for almost 50 years now, and it's a quite ubiquitous term. So here I include music, aesthetics, the 4 elements, resistance, battling, and as well as the arts and discipline of it. In terms of pedagogy, we are talking about schooling based, but also teaching any of the above in and out of school settings, and ties to critical education approaches in particular. As far as theory, I focus on those that interrogate the intersections of the above, but not just within music or aesthetics, which tends to get the lion's share of the spotlight. I include early work informed by humanities and then kind of move to social sciences. In terms of research, there's a lot of great work, as you all know, that recognizes and nuances the complexity, richness, and agency of the linguistic and cultural practices tied to hip hop. So I'm not going to try and legitimize that. I'm going to focus on Samuel Leem's 2011 suggestions within the Review of Education Research, with a focus on English education, along the likes of Morel and Duncan Andrade's work in Oakland, Lin's work in Hong Kong, and Sarkar and Lowe's work in Montreal. So one of the hip hop possibilities that I want to engage, Liam talks about the widespread tendency for hip-hop pedagogies to sanitize hip-hop for inclusion in schools. Many scholars self-select hip-hop texts or only allow students to bring in texts that are morally in line with progressive, middle-class, or even bourgeois politics and sensibilities. So this is a constant tension in this work, especially with regards to checking one's own researcher, teacher positionality and privilege. So there's that part of it, and kind of like, you know, being aware of dictating that within the situation. But also kind of stepping back, the issue of a drive-by pedagogy, doing the project for a grant or a short-term study, and then just kind of like leaving the community where you did that work. And also the sustainability of transformative outcomes. Say you're able to do some great work. Can it continue beyond your cool summer program, beyond the semester, et cetera? In addition, Alim talks about needing more examinations of the possibilities of global illiteracies in schools as he discusses it. So I partly address this today, looking at Hong Kong, Asian American, and quote unquote mixed race schooling contexts over multi-year projects which demand transnational and intersectional analyses, because we're talking about like hyper diverse contexts. I include a little image here back in the day, working on Dr. Lin's ELT project when she was at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. A methodology. So in terms of my positionality, I'm an insider and outsider coming from an international hip hop nexus of Los Angeles. And the issue of cultural appropriation is always present. I've negotiated that over the years, kind of being taken up as a disciple of established hip hop artists, becoming an artist myself, and being involved in education and organizing work with hip hop practices and communities. I'm a non-Black preferred minority, Asian American, and a cis male from middle-class immigrant family. So following Okahiro 2011, that affects when and where I enter these discussions. In addition, I came around within the conscious era of hip hop in the 1990s. So that's not the situation of the state of the music these days. In terms of my approach, generally using critical ethnography and PAR approaches. I did this work in Los Angeles for 10 years with an elementary school cohort, following the same cohort into high school. All were BIPOC youth, working class, and from mixed backgrounds. So Latinx, Asian, African American. Also in Hong Kong, I did this work for 5 years with undergraduates and new teachers who are from mixed South and Southeast Asian backgrounds, and also from different Chinese heritage backgrounds, and first in the family to college, university. So to Los Angeles, the theory that we drew from it in trying to do this work, drew from resistance, problem-posing education, funds of knowledge, additive lingualism, but you know, I know it was the early 2000s, so that was the theory that we were working with at the time. Later on, community organizing and new literacy studies were added to the mix. So what did we do in terms of pedagogy? From year 1 to 4, when the students were in elementary, we did home visits, and that included regular mixing of African-American English, Cantonese, Spanish, Vietnamese, Khmer, and other things that were in the community. And that connected to what we did in the classroom on a daily basis. So we also utilized hip hop practices and aesthetics embedded across subjects and partnerships with community organizations, organized labor, and universities. We emphasized community arts, so that included murals, dance, spoken word, and museum work. And by the 3rd year of this, we had the top scores within the school in English and math, in addition to kind of like cool outcomes with spoken word and dance and performances. From year 5 through 10, we switched to off-campus work. There was a traveling martial arts group. We did graffiti, dance, and music creation. PAR projects included making video documentaries about their communities, and that informed youth organizing work. In terms of hip hop specifically, it was explicit in some of our most visible and fundable spaces. But according to the youth, actually, this was not the most essential thing. Their identities and spaces were more eclectic, as they put it, and they could draw from electronic dance music or punk, but they did include hip hop, which was everywhere at that time. And it wasn't really an identity of resistance in and of itself anymore like it was for me. In terms of translanguaging, we built spaces, our educational spaces upon Latinx, Asian, and mixed communities that we were working with and the students were coming from, in addition to accessing and building upon the African-American prevalence within pop media and official forms of multiculturalism within schooling, government, et cetera. Students reported that the most agentic aspect of this work, following up with them in high school on stuff we did in elementary school, they felt that mixing between the other linguistic and cultural practices was agentic for them across academics, arts, activism, and it helped them see themselves in others and have a broadened, expanded view of the world. The youth often, on a smaller note, the youth often referred to themselves or one another as the N-word. And mind you, this is mostly Latinx and Asian students, but they identified with a Black struggle. And part of this was informed by hip hop, but also just living where they lived. We noticed they also wouldn't say this with the adults, coaches, teachers, et cetera, in the room. Finally, unlike other parts of the US, these communities actually increased in terms of racial solidarity, even with the interracial gang tensions that were going on in the community. Okay, in my final content slide, I'm gonna talk about Hong Kong. So in terms of theory, having done this work for about 10 years and moving to Hong Kong, I developed an idea of a process of recognition, solidarity, and collaboration towards building third spaces in education. But also interrogating and building on the mistakes of the past doing this work before, using indigenous and intersectional lenses to disrupt things like the kind of Christian confessional paradigms that we still see in hip hop, such as like, oh, just getting on that mic or spoken word and just liberating yourself and speaking your truth to the universe, but how that can also be, can lead to some issues that we weren't necessarily ready to deal with. And also male savior models of the critical, even for BIPOC educators and those from the community doing hip hop. Finally, also issues and connections between whiteness and Chineseness, which is something emerging in the literature and I've drawn some attention to in terms of who was the one kind of like within the racial hierarchy on top, and issues of Han Chinese racism and hegemony, things like that. In terms of pedagogy, we had a small scale pipeline that started with undergraduate courses. Then we asked a few kind of middle achieving students to join the research team. We did PAR projects. We had paid office hours to kind of help them with their financial needs. We had monthly workshops on methodology and theory. And we also did things like meals, social outings, and we started presenting at conferences, academic conferences, and have published a little bit together. And these undergrads went on to become teachers, graduate students, and activists, some of which are still involved in the Hong Kong protests. In terms of hip hop, our very first research project was focused on pop culture pedagogies and with artists and educators. But after talking to them initially in the pilot study, we had to move to call it pop culture. There was various reasons for this, but one of the things was that hip hop artists were no longer a draw and it wasn't fundable in Hong Kong like it was in the 2000s. So even the well-known friends that I made from Dr. Lin's studies were no longer kind of just focused on hip hop. And the young folks that were doing this were mostly coming from Indonesian, Nepalese, Filipino communities, and they identified as brown, and non-Chinese backgrounds, basically males. The dance was still popular, but not the local music. And in terms of the Chinese artists that were doing it, there were some shared themes around class issues, but the elephant in the room was always about the Hong Kong's racial hierarchy between Chinese people and those that consider themselves or were labeled as brown. And that's not even considering tensions with those from mainland China. In terms of translanguaging, Hong Kong is known for a cool heteroglossic trilingual education context, but Hong Kong also has understudied inequities that are crucial for minoritized youth. And the youth that we talked with discussed how Chinese racism towards brown communities in Hong Kong was one of the major issues for them and kind of brought them all together. And some of the things that we see in terms of white supremacy in North America were being reproduced by Chinese people in Hong Kong. In addition, the elitism of the Hong Kong Cantonese variety within the local scene, but also abroad, folks coming from the diaspora into Hong Kong and things, that was a tension as well. My last note is about critical Chinese heritage scholars who maybe grew up in Australia or went to school in North America, and they identified as minorities and people of color. And so when they came to Hong Kong, they still saw the legacies of colonization, white folks on top in academia, et cetera. And so they identified themselves with minorities, but they often couldn't see their privilege with the brown youth that they were working with and teachers. So, and this was exacerbated by the theory's focus on white supremacy within the hierarchies of the global north. And so it was difficult to see within the Hong Kong context. So these are the references of things I've been talking about. I have additional, like in yellow, the citations of things that I've done. And here's my email, academia site, and the music site, so we can connect further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the next presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation and thank you for inviting me for this great conference. So I'd like to talk about translingual practices of Korean hip hoppers today. And my name is Jaehyun Im, and I'm a PhD student at Indiana University. So hip hop has been regarded as a global culture that attracts many young people to create so-called global hip hop nation. And hip hop has been crossing all the physical and imaginary boundaries to provide local cultures with a new and fresh ideology. So previous studies on hip hop localization showed linguistic creativity, local use of local languages, English and African American English, and creation of so-called new English that has not been indexed in, and whose ownership has not been argued in terms of a geographical or political distinctions. However, little research has been approached through the lens of translingualism, especially for the case of Korean hip hop. They usually study the lyrics, which ended up excluding many more spoken discourses like on-stage performance or off-stage communications. Also, English seemed to be the default language, which overlooked the hybrid language in use. Therefore, to fill this gap, I seek to answer two questions. How are linguistic and cultural resources used by Korean rappers? And what are the purposes of their translingual hip hop practices? I theoretically depend on translingualism, particularly Kanagaraja 2013 and Lee 2018. Some part of their implication to use translingualism lens include multilingual speakers' use of negotiation strategies and their ability to exercise translanguaging instinct for creative language usages. So this translingualism theoretical underpinning is very important and useful to explore how Korean hip hoppers creatively use Korean language and English and hip hop cultural repertoires to express their hip hopper voices. Just briefly, there have been studies, hip hop crossing research, especially in the East Asian context. So they show that African American English is localized to express Korean youth identities, and a specific hip hop discourse marker like a yo is localized to perform various functions that have not been indexed in African American English or American hip hop. Standard English is also used with the very specific purposes, like to express homage or respect to American hip hop, or to keep realness and authenticity of their local hip hop music. Also, East Asian rappers who sometimes were categorized as English as foreign language speakers who depend on English as native language speakers are in fact actively creating a new type of English that can be accepted within hip hop discourse and by those who share hip hop spirit or culture. In addition, cultural spirit such as keep it real is localized and transformed to address local issues in Korea, such as military duty or hierarchical relationship among rappers, especially men. And recently, some studies explored word formation in Korean pop culture and Korean hip hop from translanguaging perspective, as you see N and Kaira 2020. So in order to understand Korean hip hoppers' translingual strategies, I collected data from music, including lyrics and onstage performances, and onstage interaction, including stage talk before and after performances, and offstage spoken data from social media posting or media interviews. And I analyzed them focusing on the use of English words, African American English references, and Korean. In analyzing Korean language, I refer to Korean official references and online websites to determine whether it's indexed or accepted in the Korean language community. And also my analytic focus was on English-Korean mixing and co-meshing. So I have 4 findings. One is hip-hop based English expression with Korean polite markers. So these 2 screenshots are from Korean rap audition programs, and they express their hip-hopper identity through hip-hop based or shared expressions and display politeness to audition judges and or senior rappers through Korean politeness markers. So 2 expressions I brought are 비트 주세요, which is the combination of English loan word beat, transliterated in Korean, and Korean predicate, which has honorific marker 시 and polite ending 어요. Another expression is let's go 하겠습니다. And as you see, this is the combination of English expression let's go, which is full sentence, and Korean predicate that includes a formal speech marker to indicate a speaker's will to do, get, and deferential ending, 씁니다, to indicate their politeness. So you might think there's no matching word for beat, for example, in Korean, and thus the rappers use just English word. However, one of the episodes of the rap audition program show that the judges, the rappers, make fun of the Korean word for beat, 장단, and they left out because that language, the Korean word 장단, does not belong to hip-hop discourse and does not carry any hip-hop vibe. And second finding is hip-hop based Korean expressions that are not indexed and shared, but intelligible, especially those who have English repertoires. So in an interview of the rapper Benzino, he said in Korean, to save their ass or due to their entertainment, there must be a climate where they cannot speak up. So he used the non-conventional Korean expression to save their ass. And this could be from the English, African-American English term ass out, which means in real bad trouble. And the Korean equivalent of ass in the Korean language has no connotation of life. Now I would like to focus on the second example of rapper Swings. And in the audition program, Swing says in Korean, in the Korean language, he said, the first round at the audition is weirdly difficult. It's not because of rapping a cappella. It's just something like 8 very heavy elephants on my shoulder. I hate this feeling, but I did it anyway. So his use of 8 very heavy elephants on my shoulder in Korean, it's not indexed, it's not defined in the Korean language. So it could be coming from African-American English, which is any ear filled with bad luck, or English expression as Dr. Benji said, used the previous presentation, the elephant in the room, meaning a problem or troubling situation that is obvious, but it's ignored. So these non-conventional Korean expressions may be understood as they intended due to the context they are used, but the origin of the expressions could be African-American English in a sense that the rappers are kind of multilingual speakers who are familiar with Korean Standard English and African-American English, and their creative usages show that they can shuttle between languages. Third finding is words play through different meanings of Standard English, African-American English, and Korean. So I'd like to play the video clip. I'd like to play like a full version, but due to the time limit, I have to stop here. And as you see, the rapper Kitty Boy used the word sick. As you see it from 1 to 3rd line, you try to look cool, but you look sick. In that context, sick is used as standard English meaning. So one being physically and emotionally in a poor condition. But after that, he used in another sense, I'm sick too. So that sick means good or outstanding, unique, and the best of its kind, as used in African American English. And he code switched from Korean to English to show that he uses sick in 3 languages. He tries to distinguish hip hop fans or hip hop rappers from non-hip hop community members by using different meanings that what sick means in 3 languages. And final finding, the last finding is functional appropriation / functional resemblance. So let's look at the video clip, and please look at how he uses word 바크. So as you see, he used this word 바크 for like attention getter, a term of endearment, and pause filler in his music and every spoken discourse. This word 바크 actually originated from the combination of a Korean curse word, I'm not gonna pronounce it, and a nominal counter by deleting some syllables to neutralize its negativity. And its spelling variation, like PPAQQU or BBAGGEU, allows this word to be spread in multiple contexts. And this is in line with so-called phonetic resemblance of British English by Mongolian rock band. They use this strategy as a means of expressing authenticity to depend on the notion of the birthplace of English rock. And this is a functional appropriation, I would call, of American rappers' use of signature sound. So if you are like American hip hop fans, then you may heard of rapper designers like a grrrah, or Cardi B's like a okrrr, or like a eskiri or skr. Those signature sounds, instead of using those signature sounds as American rappers do, this rapper created new Korean hip hop expression to express his own rapper identity. I don't have much time, right? So I'm not gonna read my conclusion, but the point of my study is to showcase that Korean hip hoppers are not just like a copycats of American hip hop. They do translanguaging practices in a global hip hop discourse, which is translanguaging zone, wherein Korean hip hoppers' translanguaging instinct is realized through various co-meshing practices and creative usages of what is available to them. And as you see, no one language played a dominant role in expressing their identity. I'm still working on this paper, so wish me luck. I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you. We're gonna move on to our 3rd presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm delighted to be in the company of people who know so much more about hip hop than I do. I'm coming at this from the perspective of an English teacher. So back in 2011, I was teaching English at a university in southern Serbia as a State Department English language fellow. And I became friends with a lot of my students on Facebook. It was the way that they wanted to communicate. And I just noticed that a lot of them were sort of constantly switching back and forth between languages, including one of my all-time favorite students who just happened to be a hip hop artist. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is a study that I did on the sort of digital writing and translanguaging practices of one particular student. So let me go to the slideshow, actually. Should be easier to see. Okay. So in the study, I was curious to find out what motivated students as they were using all of these diverse language resources, and in particular, how they were using English to construct both local and global identities, which I saw them doing. So I chose some participants who were especially active and were especially active in multiple languages. I got their permission to review their Facebook news feeds for several months. This was after I'd already come back to the States and contacted them again. And then I ended up doing both open-ended and text-based interviews with them using a sort of literacy narrative framework. So the concept that I was working with, I was actually studying with Suraj Kanagaraja at the time. So unsurprisingly, I was working with the concept of translanguaging, which he defines as the ability of multilingual speakers to shuttle between languages, treating the diverse languages that form their repertoires as an integrated system, which is what I saw my students doing. And I think it's particularly interesting to study how translanguaging gets represented in digital writing. I think it's been well established that students use social media as the sort of what's called an unregulated space to perform identities that are often not available to them in traditional educational settings. That was especially true for my student who's a hip hop artist. Online writing is marked not only by incredible amounts of creativity, freedom of expression, sort of open expression of identity, but also multimodality, right? It shifts back and forth between images and videos and links, like really in a natural way that students take advantage of. And it's also been established that digital writing for students who either live cross-border lives or aspire to cross-border lives is used to maintain relationships across borders and to create these sort of transnational identities, which definitely played out for my student. I think it's also, at the time that I was doing this study, Facebook already had over 1 billion users, and now it's closer to 3 billion. It reaches everybody. It's a free platform for especially artists who want to promote their work. And the thing that became important in my study is that Facebook also positions users as gatekeepers of information. So you pick and choose what you're going to share, and in choosing what to share, you position yourself as an expert and as a member of particular communities. So people who studied social media writing have talked about linking as a self-representational tool, right? As you're picking and choosing among what you're going to post. And in particular, that as you're captioning these links, that you're re-contextualizing them. You're putting them in a frame of your choosing that tells people not only what you feel about them, but who you are and how you position yourself in relation to these ideas and these videos. So Andrej, the student that I was working with, at the time, he was a 21-year-old student. He was majoring in English. He's since gone on to become an English teacher. And as far as I know, he's still rapping. He was at the time a member of a very popular Serbian language rap duo, and he rapped exclusively in Serbian, not in English, although he was fluent in English as a fourth-year student and used it quite a bit in his online presence. So when I talked to him about his participation in hip hop, he described it as starting from a very young age. He said he started listening to American hip hop at the age of 6, that he maintained, in addition to Facebook, a website when he could afford it to promote his Serbian language rap, and that he was already transnational, that he collaborated with rappers specifically in Germany, but across the world in a project that he called the Worldwide Connection, right? And this was, of course, back in 2012. I don't know if it's survived. So when I started looking at Andrej's Facebook representation, this is what I saw. The images on his Facebook page changed pretty regularly over the course of the time that I observed him, but it was almost always hip hop related images. He very seldom had a picture of himself as his profile. It was usually an album cover. So something like this is what you would see. And in his sort of self-presentation, both online and offline, when he talked, he adopted, as sort of even with me, his English teacher, this very sort of playful hip hop persona, right? So I asked him in my, sort of serious way, what he was using Facebook for. He said promoting his music, also hooking up with promiscuous young ladies, right? So he's projecting this, this sort of hip hop image. It was important to him to be part of that community. When I started actually counting to sort of verify what I was seeing in his posts, there's this dominance of links, right? The vast majority of what he was doing on Facebook was links to videos, mostly with text, but not always. So, something like 60 to 80% of what he was posting, right? It wasn't about him, it was links to videos. When I asked him about this, so I'll give you a couple of examples of what this looked like. So he would post a link, and then the writing around that link would be code meshed, right? So here it says malo, which is, I hope nobody speaks Serbian here. My Serbian is terrible. Malo R&B, malo chill out, a little bit R&B, a little bit chill out. So he's telling you how he feels about this video. And this is one of the sort of more elaborate ones. So what he says here in his dialect of Serbian, which is already a regional dialect, that he's reading an article. He says, "Čitam za ovu pesmu neki članak." I'm reading an article that says that that this song has a late night jazz vibe, right? And so you can see him code switching here. And he says, "By God, for me, this is really good on this late rainy night." So when I asked him about it, he said, yeah, I'm listening to this song. It's actually raining outside. I'm reading an article about it, right? And it says that it has a late night jazz vibe. So he's bringing in all of this sort of intertextuality into this and sort of, performing himself as a knowledgeable, sort of deeply connected member of this community. And so I asked him, so you're writing across languages, and I know that you communicate with people in Germany who don't speak Serbian. Like, does it matter to you that it's Serbian, part English? And he says it doesn't matter. The people who know me know what I'm talking about. And when I pushed him on that a little bit, I said, so you're mixing Serbian and English together. He says, I wasn't aware of it. I mean, we use English on so many English words on such a regular basis. So for him, I see evidence of the sort of translingual disposition, right? For him, these languages are interconnected. He's drawing on all of them to make meaning. He's not even really paying attention to this back and forth. And so I sort of kept pushing him about that. And I said, okay, well, but when you communicate with people who, don't speak one of the languages that you speak, how do you take that audience into consideration? And he says, it doesn't really matter what language you use when you post a link with it too. If they like the link, they'll like your posts. And if they don't, they won't. So what I see him doing here is displaying this for himself, this deeply translingual orientation, right? For him, his languages are connected, but he understands that that's not going to work for everyone. When he's framing these video links, he knows that the link itself is what's crucial. It's that gatekeeping of information, right? He's presenting the link. And the language that he puts around it allows him to express the local identity together with the global identity, but it sort of doesn't matter to the communicative act he's trying to do. So here's what I see him doing. I see him expressing membership in this global hip hop community by picking out and describing and sort of interacting with these links. He portrays it by his sort of self-presentation, his images, his linguistic style, but also when he selects what to post and what to share. That's part of his membership. He also himself orients to his own language practices as translingual, but he's very aware that he has audiences that don't share that, that orientation or that repertoire. He knows that the links are the important thing, right? That's his membership. So ultimately, I think what he's doing is, in a very savvy way, using the multimodal affordances of online writing as a resource. He can communicate across boundaries, transnationally, translingually, but he can maintain his local, right? And again, he only raps in Serbian, right? His local identity that's extremely important to him. He's using his own dialect, as well as standard Serbian, as well as English. And he can still participate as sort of a global member of the wider hip hop community. So did I get under 12 minutes? I feel like I did. Yeah, and I'll pass the mic back over.
Thank you. You're good. You still actually have 1 minute left.
Yes,
you.
I didn't time it. It's just serendipity.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we're gonna move on to our discussion by Professor Andrej.
Unmute. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for 3 very rich presentations, and all of these represent your lifelong engagement. I mean, so far, your very intense and focused and passionate engagement with the work of these young people, no matter which context they are in. I just want to introduce this idea that as I was listening to you, I think you were engaging hip hop as all these things, which you could tell me whether I have been reading your presentations. I think hip hop as border crossing. As I listened to all of your presentations, I could see and hear how these young people as crossing borders. These borders can be physical borders, they are actual immigrants or migrants. They can be socio-cultural, socio-economic borders. They were positioned in different socio-economic classes or cultural groups or gender groups or ethnic groups, being positioned by others or self-positioning, but also they are also constantly crossing border with their hip hop activities, their hip hop innovations, as so beautifully illustrated by your examples like Dr. Im's Korean examples, how these hip hop rappers are meshing and mixing and crossing boundaries of languages, including hip hop languages from different styles, different countries, and all the while playing this attitude as it's play that is innovated by us. We innovate with the genre, we innovate with the language, we innovate with the style, and we are crossing borders, and we are having fun all the time. So I can see from your examples. And then hip hop as this attitude, I mean, it's always hip hop. You cannot have hip hop without an attitude. Whatever the attitude could be, it's very much situated in every single different context. But it's always a kind of critical attitude, always a kind of disrupting the complacent, the so-called harmonious facade of a society, like in Hong Kong that Dr. Benjamin Zhang so much illustrated how when the hip hoppers are from the minoritized South Asian groups, and they use hip hop as a way of transgressing and protesting and resisting the dominant Cantonese culture or the dominant Chinese culture. And at the same time, the Cantonese hip hoppers that I worked with, they use hip hop as a way of transgressing the English dominant culture. So you can see that it is a way of resisting, a way of protesting, and it can never be essentialized as belonging to any single group of people. So depending on your positioning, but it's always a way of saying, we don't like the situation, we don't like the status quo. It's always rocking the boat. That kind of attitude that I can see from your example. And it's always as a way of transgression or transgressive being and becoming. It's always going beyond the trans, this prefix trans, as many TESOL practitioners in our audience will know trans is going beyond, as this prefix means. So for hip hoppers or hip hop people, these young people usually they use hip hop as a way of transgressing the status quo, whether it is a linguistic status quo with a linguistic hierarchy. In Hong Kong, it would be like English, Chinese, Cantonese, and then the South Asian minoritized groups, languages. There's this hierarchy, the status quo, linguistic status quo, that these young people appropriate to transgress, to disrupt the linguistic hierarchy. And depending on the positioning of these people, these young people engage in this, using hip hop to transgress, to interrogate the status quo. It's always critically interrogating, questioning the status quo. But of course, hip hop itself is also full of conflictual tensions, because hip hop culture as a culture is very masculine. It's a very masculine dominant culture. So within hip hop itself, you can also see this kind of disruption from within the female hip hoppers, hip hop rappers, hip hop artists, and always also disrupting the internal culture, the tensions. So I would call this a hip hop as method, in the sense that method is not like our research method. Hip hop as a lens, as epistemic lens, as a way of seeing what's happening, a way of helping us to say, hey, everywhere in different contexts, we could see in Korea, in the States, in Hong Kong, or in different contexts that our three brilliant speakers have illustrated with their focused research work. In whatever context, you will see hip-hop gives you this kind of cultural resisting, protesting, transgressing, border crossing culture, but at the same time it's play. It's also play. This play is always satirical. So you're having fun, but at the same time you're also doing all these things together. So that's why it's so compelling as a way of protesting, resisting, transgressing, border crossing. And it's full of tensions and full of what Bakhtin calls this heteroglossic, multiple voices, heteroglossic, even within the hip hop communities, depending on your positioning, your gender positioning, ethnic positioning, sociocultural, socio-ethnic, and your linguistic, socio-linguistic positioning, whether it is being positioned by the hierarchies of the mainstream dominant society or your own self-positioning. So I could see that all of your work so brilliantly illustrated all these different groups of artists, of young people, of rappers, and they are engaged in these. And then we would ask, why are they engaged in this? Because they have anger. But this anger is turned into a very productive anger. And then as they are engaged in hip hop creativity, this anger is turned into a kind of critical creativity, a critical play, which also has an attitude. It's not just play for entertainment, as hip hop could be domesticated by teachers as a pedagogy to teach English, or hip hop can be domesticated by the entertainment industry as entertainment. So hip hop can also be domesticated, but you see these bottom-up, these spontaneous activities initiated by young people, by protesting transgressive activities. They cannot be domesticated. Then we see this tension, because this is a TESOL webinar. As TESOL teachers, TESOL practitioners, and I have been guilty as one of them. I have been guilty of trying to domesticate hip hop as a pedagogy, but if it isn't a kind of critical pedagogy, then you can never be successful. I can never be successful. So there is opportunity. and that's also the risk in approaching hip hop from TESOL perspectives. That is, we need to have a soul-searching analysis of our own positionality. As any TESOL practitioner in our audience today, and why are you here in this webinar? Number one, do you just want to learn more about hip hop? Then you can just read up the literature. You want to learn hip hop as a way of teaching English? Then I have to tell you my experience, and I'm guilty of it. You can never succeed. Students see you as domesticating hip hop. So, but if you use hip hop, if you engage with hip hop and let young people create, let young people cross borders, linguistic borders, language borders, and also their socio-cultural, their identity borders, then really interesting things, really creative, disruptive, and innovative things could happen. So I will end my preliminary comments here, and I want to thank all the speakers with your billion examples illustrating your intense work with these young people.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. I want to thank each speaker for their wonderful presentation. We have a few minutes remaining, and we would like to go over all the interesting questions in the chat. However, due to the time constraint, we probably can only go over one or two. So this is a question from Colin Core. So hip hop pedagogy as a pedagogy of transcription. Do we notice any difference in how you create space for solidarity in school versus out of school? Is there any speaker who can address this question? This question is originally addressed to Dr. Chen, but I guess anyone can just jump in.
Okay, I could go first. I think when we started to try to apply some of these things in critical pedagogies at that time with the students as they were in elementary and middle school, it kind of became clear more and more this element of performance, and that what they were doing at school was kind of a performance as well, and that they could not be just limited by that. They saw themselves in and out of there, and it wasn't just wholly identifying them, labeling them, compartmentalizing them. So there was some, they went to school, they did that, they would follow their crews, their gang, whatever it was, but outside of school, which was real life to them, they did engage in much more interracial solidarity and types of things like that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, because I was out of Zoom for a few seconds, and now I don't have access to all the questions in the chat. But I remember there's a question about the cross inferences, cross fertilization. So did any of you see not only the translanguaging going from the US to other cultural contexts such as Hong Kong, such as Korea, but also actually there's influence back to the United States or globally. Do you see any evidence of cross-fertilization?
I take a quick stab at that. My sense is that translanguaging is a much sort of older and broader practice than the United States. I don't think that we invented it and spread it around. I think what I've seen and what I've seen in other research is that yeah, the translanguaging way predates any of the things that we're talking about, right? That that multilingualism is the global norm, and that monolingualism is actually the exception. So that's my take on it.
Okay, thank you. We can go over another question. Okay, from Jennifer Burton. She said, I understand that tension that Dr. Lin speak about in domesticating hip hop. Does that mean keep out of classroom? If not, what would you suggest to educators who wish to engage hip hop or spoken word in their pedagogies for language learning?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful, wonderful question. That's why, as TESOL, we are used to attending webinars saying, oh, this is a good methodology, right? So now I like to say, no, we need to go beyond this methodology. With hip hop, we don't have a fixed methodology or pedagogy. It's always transgressing, right? So the power of hip hop is that you cannot pin it down as one pedagogy, but there's still the spirit, that is transgressive spirit and heteroglossic spirit, and the courage to deal with tensions. As teachers, I know in my past 30 years, I know how teachers can be very much afraid of tensions in the classroom, and myself included, okay? But if we want to engage with hip hop as a method, as a critical transgressive pedagogy, then we need to be prepared to deal with tensions in our classroom. And also tensions that our students will be interrogating our curriculum, our TESOL curriculum. And we ourselves as teachers, if we are also prepared to go with the flow, so to pick up this hip hop, go with the flow. If our students are engaged with interrogating our TESOL curriculum, are we willing to go with flow? If we are, then I encourage you to engage with hip hop as a method, hip hop as a critical pedagogy, hip hop as a transgressive way of teaching, of learning, of becoming. And it takes a lot of courage because we are situated in the institution. Everywhere we are put into a box. We cannot transgress outside of the curriculum box, of the pedagogical box, of the classroom box. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't use it in the classroom, but be prepared to be going with a transgressive flow. Okay. Maybe Benji or other speakers can add to the response.
Thank you. With Dr. Lin's comment in mind, we must conclude today's webinar. Today's presentation was titled Hip Hop Translanguaging, Negotiated Community Participation, a TESOL bilingual, multilingual education interest section webinar. A special shout out to TESOL International for their continued support for our outreach effort. And thanks to Dr. Deborah Shaw, TESOL president, for joining us today. Last but not least, a special thank you to all of our presenters and the moderators. Okay, this will conclude today's webinar. Please don't forget to join us for more discussion on MyTESOL, Facebook, and Twitter. Thank you, everyone. Take care and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.